We've talked about selective attention already, and now I want to spend just a little bit of time about divided attention, and then a paper we'll discuss will be about divided attention as well. So, divided attention is all about combining tasks and then trying to do multiple things at once and do them well. And that's not always really quite possible, right? So the question is, what makes that certain things go well together and you're fine in executing or attending to both, whereas in other cases you're really not? Now, part of this is related to how much you have practiced the two or three or whatever number of tasks that you're trying to simultaneously do. Um, People typically become able to do two things alongside each other that may originally have been very difficult. So, for example, if you remember when you learned how to drive, if you drive, originally you kind of had to really focus on driving, and any sort of other thing in the meanwhile was extremely distracting. Even singing a song while driving, and of course none of you do this, but let's imagine you did, right? It only is going to take several hours of practice for you to be able to start driving pretty okay and actually sing as well. Now, you can then ask, well, how is it that that actually happens, and what makes things or tasks automatic versus non-automatic? Because in general, it's the case that if a task is non-automatic, it's going to be harder to combine that task with another task. Whereas once a task does become automatic, it's a little bit easier to combine it with another task. So when we want to talk about divided attention, let's first talk about what makes that things can become automatic. The idea is this: originally, when you engage in a pretty difficult task or some skill learning or something like that, you have to engage in fairly controlled processing, meaning you got to pay close attention, very top down, and if you're looking for something that's difficult to figure out, first you're searching for something that may be very slow and controlled, and then over time you become better and better at dividing your attention. Automatic processing in that case would actually happen when you don't even need to really intend and attend to the task that you're engaged in, but you're just able to do it. So how does this happen? Now, some early research by Snyder and Schifrin basically designed a very, very simple task where people would see a couple of different letters on a computer screen, and their task was just to figure out whether a particular letter showed up that they had made a target. So what happened was that people were given, let's say, something to remember, let's say number 3, that was their target, and then they could vary, for example, how long and how many targets there were. And then there would very quickly be flashed a bunch of slides that had a number of letters on them. And they had to basically figure out whether any of the targets was actually presented on those screens or not. So this will become more clear when I give you an example of it. So what they varied here was the mapping between a particular number and whether that number in a particular in a trial was actually a target or a distractor. So in one case, it may be that targets would be numbers and distractors would all be letters. And then in a varied mapping condition, this would actually constantly change. So what I mean by this is the following. Let's say you're being given as a target number 3. Then you get a bunch of slides with a bunch of letters and the number on it. And you basically are then being asked, was the number 3 that you were supposed to keep track of, was that actually showing up on any of the slides? Right? In this case, there's a consistent mapping because the 3 is always a target, number is always a target, and the distractors are all letters. Now, in the inconsistent case, it could be like this, where the P was given as a target, then you saw a whole bunch of letters, so a letter could be a distractor or a target, and in this case the P showed up, so the answer would be yes. But then, in the next trial, here's where it got tricky. Now you were giving a new target, the letter T, and the letter P still showed up, but it was now actually a distractor, so it was no longer a target anymore. And in that condition, as the target and the distractors constantly were changing, people actually didn't get all that much better at this. So when there was a consistent mapping, let's say P was always a target, you see that it took people very little time, and even with short durations, they were able to quickly learn and consistently identify whether the target was there or not. With varied mapping, they needed much more time between each of the letter frames in order to start successfully identifying that the letter that they were given as a target was there or not. Right? So this is basically showing you that in order for something to become automatic, there has to be a consistent mapping between what's a target and what's a distractor. If constantly everything keeps changing, it becomes very hard to actually develop automaticity. So if you want to loop this back to, let's say, driving, imagine for a second that every time you drive, they have a different rule about whether a green light means go or a green light means stop. You could imagine that in that case, it's actually pretty difficult to become completely automatic at just going through a green light and stopping at a red light. You would probably make a lot of mistakes, or you would have to be really deliberate about it. Given that we have a consistent mapping between green means go and red means stop, just like we have a consistent mapping between you turn your wheel to the left and the car goes to the left, that's the kind of stuff that allows people to develop automaticity. If there's always a changing mapping between some sort of condition and the supposed response, then automaticity can actually not really develop.